Good morning, everybody. I'm Kathy Minahan. I'm president of the NACD New England chapter. Thank you for joining us for our third installment of our Systemic Racism series of virtual programs. There is no way to overestimate the importance of this topic to all of the boards we sit on and to society more generally. I am so proud that this chapter has made DE&I, specifically anti-racism, a top priority in our programming calendar. Let me cover a few odds and ends, housekeeping items before we start. First, we'd love to see our attendees' faces. We'll have the speakers spotlighted for portions of the program, but we encourage our members to use their video when possible. We ask that you remain muted throughout the program and use the chat function to pose questions. We'll have a Q&A period at the end of the program, but we'll be monitoring the chat throughout, and the panel may well address questions during the discussion. As always, we ask you to share your thoughts and comments on the program by filling out the post-event survey so we know what works and what doesn't. You'll receive this by mail following today's event. Now, this next slide, Deb, highlights our sponsors. Actually, I thought we had a slide with all the sponsors. Deb, there we go. Our sponsors make our chapter activities possible, especially during this time of virtual gatherings. The continued loyalty of all of these organizations underscores the important role of NACD. It's their support, as I said, that allows us to fulfill our mission of delivering world-class, director-centric, local programming and peer-to-peer sharing of insights that's vital to advancing excellence in the boardroom. And I also want to highlight in particular our spotlight sponsors for today. They are Ernst & Young, Korn Ferry, and Pay Governance. They've really been standing by our side throughout all of our pandemic programming. With that, it's my pleasure to bring Micho Spring into the program. Micho is this morning's moderator. She's a good friend of all of us on the call, I'm sure, or many of us anyway. She's the director of Weber Shandwick's global corporate practice and president of its New England region. She brings extensive experience in both the public and private sectors. In her work as a communication strategist, Micho focuses on enabling corporate clients to use communications to support their business strategies. I don't know about you, the boards you serve on, but communications is a hot topic for all of us, particularly given the many challenges we're facing these days. She counsels people on how to use communications to support strategies, to enhance and protect reputations, and to respond to public policy challenges. She's counseled clients across industries on a wide range of reputational issues. She spent 6 years as CEO of Boston Telecommunications Company and 4 years as deputy mayor of Boston under Mayor White. She's a director of the National Bank Holdings Corp. And holds memberships in numerous nonprofit boards, including the JFK Library Foundation and the Mass Conference for Women. Born in Havana, Micho is also founding chair of Friends of Caritas Cubana, a nonprofit providing humanitarian services in Cuba. Micho.
Thank you, Kathy, for that very kind introduction and for your leadership at NACD and in so many places in our community. So thank you. I'm so pleased to be moderating today's program on a topic that is so important to all of us, to the Commonwealth, to the country, and to the world at large. In this era where human capital drives business, attracting and retaining the best talent is the #1 priority for all of our companies, and eliminating racism is key to that. So I'm delighted to be here today. Today's program will have two sections. We'll start with a conversation with Tony Coles, the co-chair of the Black Economic Alliance and executive chairman and CEO of Cerevel Therapeutics. We will then move into a panel discussion with Lee Pelton, who just completed his tenure as president of Emerson College and is now president of the Boston Foundation, and Kiana Schmiedel, global head, culture and inclusion at Wayfair. We'll allow plenty of time for questions throughout and following the panel discussion. So we encourage all of you to send us your questions. With that, I'm pleased to be here with Dr. Coles, chairperson and chief executive officer of Cerevel Therapeutics, a biopharmaceutical company dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of the brain to treat neuroscience diseases. Dr. Coles has a long and storied career in the biopharmaceutical industry. In addition to his role at Cerevel, he's a founding investor and the chairman of Humanity Therapeutics, and previously served as chairman and chief executive officer of Onyx Pharmaceuticals, and chief executive officer and a member of the board of directors of NPS Pharmaceuticals, Inc. Dr. Coles is also a role model in giving back through his many philanthropic endeavors. He's a member of the Council for the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, and a founder and co-chairman of the Black Economic Alliance, an organization dedicated to fostering greater economic opportunity in the Black community. He also serves as a member of the Board of Trustees for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, a member of the Board of Directors of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member on the Harvard Medical School Advisory Board. In 2021, Dr. Coles was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So, Tony, let's start with an industry that you've spent your entire life in, healthcare. You have a uniquely valuable perspective on healthcare, given the breadth of your experience from clinician to CEO. In thinking about the impact of COVID-19 and what it's meant on public health, what has this pandemic taught us or reminded us of as it relates to health equity?
Well, first of all, Michelle, good morning, and thank you for inviting us to share a few thoughts and spend the rest of the morning with Lee and Kiana. We're looking forward to that discussion, and I appreciate the time. What's actually been quite interesting, and there was so much written about this at the beginning, and of course at the height of the pandemic. It seems less so. So it gives me an opportunity to talk about some of the obvious things that we all thought about that the pandemic has shown us or reminded us. Obviously, the inequities in access to healthcare, the inequities to the delivery of healthcare, all based on systemic and then obviously racial issues. And this is work that's been well documented academically for the last 2 decades and more. We know that Black Americans and Americans of color don't receive or have access to healthcare in the same ways that white Americans do. So this is a well-documented fact. And the pandemic reminded us of that. It also reminded us of the role that pre-existing conditions play, and certainly the imbalance that pre-existing conditions like cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure had in terms of predisposing or putting Americans of color at even greater risk. At the height of the pandemic, and we remember these statistics, 20 to 30% of the cases were represented by Americans of color and Black Americans in particular, yet those 20 to 30% of cases represented 50 to 60% of deaths. And so that distinction, that separation was really a grim reminder of some of the impacts of structural racism. But let me offer something on the less obvious aspects, if I might. We talked about a pandemic within a pandemic within a pandemic, and as we watch time unfold, I'm certainly reminded, given the public health training that I've had, that an epidemic, if you will, is something that's local, regional, and contained, but a pandemic is global, and we've certainly been living with that. But the second pandemic I might offer is really the exposure that these inequities signify, affecting people of color, the infrastructural and inequities, health, economic, et cetera. And then with the tragic death of George Floyd, the third pandemic was unfolded, which was really the systemic and racial inequities that we experienced, not just in this country, because that event set off a global set of demonstrations, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it, But I'm reminded of the less obvious implications of COVID-19, not just the things that we read about in the news, but the less obvious pandemic within the pandemic within the pandemic.
Well, we certainly saw the vaccine rollout expose the lack of trust among diverse populations in the healthcare system. Are we doing enough to address that?
I don't think we are. I really don't. I think we all have a good understanding of the historical reasons, and there are good historical reasons that there is such a high degree of mistrust in communities of color, and particularly in our communities, in Black communities. Certainly the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, the Henrietta Lacks experiment, and a set of issues, if you will, really has created this atmosphere of mistrust. And I think that is certainly well-deserved. But we're not working hard enough. We are not holding ourselves as executives and leaders in this industry to a high enough standard to address it and to fix it. I certainly give Moderna a lot of credit for pausing their clinical trials when they were still testing their vaccine before it was authorized for emergency use, because they simply didn't have the representation of Black Americans and Americans of color. And it's that kind of action that's really going to be very important in addressing this issue. We also have to hold our partners and vendors accountable as well, the clinical research organizations that will help us unpack the issues around including people of color in clinical trials. But very importantly, we've got to work with community organizations to make sure we break down these barriers.
Do you think companies are doing enough of that, given the fact that the workplace plays, particularly right now, such an important role in mandating vaccines, et cetera, et cetera? What are companies doing?
Well, so if I take the example at Cerevel, for instance, because it would be important that we practice what we preach in any case, we've looked at this particular issue very carefully. Obviously, the company I lead is involved in a variety of clinical trials. You talked about the fact that they're all in the neurosciences, schizophrenia, for instance, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, a variety of dementia-related disorders that we look at. And we are in conversation with our clinical research organization partners, those who lead the clinical trials and conduct them for us, to ensure that we have adequate and good and balanced representation in the enrollment. And we'll hold them accountable there as well. One of the things I've realized as a leader, though, and as I'm sure many of you have also come to realize, is that it's the importance of the conversation inside the organization. And that discussion has actually led to, quite interestingly, a set of actions that we've been able to take, not just holding the clinical research organizations accountable for addressing this, but also ensuring that we have the right people looking at these particular topics. For instance, schizophrenia, a drug that we're currently studying, is 2 to 4 times diagnosed at a rate of 2 to 4 times more than in white Americans. And in some studies, as high as 3 to 4 times. Now, some of this is probably due to assessment bias when the clinician takes the patient in and interviews the patient. Some of it could be due to an imbalance in environmental risk factors. But if we're not cognizant of a simple fact like that, and the potential for misdiagnosis in schizophrenia for what we do in trying to understand who's appropriate for our clinical trials, then we're missing a real opportunity. And we can't get to those opportunities if we don't have the right people around the table who appreciate that fact and are really looking forward. So discussion, dialogue, sensitivity and awareness, and then accountability for the partners who will lead these areas with us.
We've seen certainly an evolution in recent years of the role of corporations through both executive management and their boards step into societal issues more than ever before, and are now expected by a new generation of employees to really channel their values. Can you discuss the role that you believe companies can and should play in making real progress on key issues such as racial justice?
So I grew up in corporate life under the very first CEO that I had the great pleasure of working for, Roy Vagelos, who held a very simple premise, and that is that you could do well by doing good. And that extended not just to how thoughtful we were in the delivery of the medications and the healthcare support we provided to those who counted on us, but also in areas where we really could make an important difference, even if there were no profit to be made. And that mantra, that simple ethos, which is the basis of George Merck's premise for starting Merck or founding Merck, which is the company I started with in my early corporate days, has stayed with me. And so if you follow the thesis that you can do well by doing good, it's really easy to find the opportunities to do just those things. We tend to talk about, for directors, for executives, for team members, senior team members, the fiduciary responsibility that we hold. But fiduciary as a word comes from the Latin faithful. And what better opportunity is there to be faithful to the stewardship opportunity we have, to the citizenship opportunity we have as corporate citizens, than to step up and to address some of these really important issues. Now, I've heard the arguments, as you have. Businessmen should stick to business, businessmen should stay out of politics, and all the things that have been headlines in the business news and in the lay press. But I'll offer this. When you're a leader, you are simply a leader, without regard for what your platform is, and you find an opportunity to use that platform for the good and the benefit of everyone who's counting on you. And increasingly these days, our employees are holding us to a very high standard. I can't begin to tell you the response I got from the employees at Cerevel following the George Floyd event. And that was in response to a letter I wrote, an open letter I wrote to the employee population, talking about personally what this meant to me. So I think the activism that we're finding in employee populations, the continuation or the extension of our role as corporate leaders and citizens, and forget corporate, just leadership at all, I think brings an opportunity for us to figure out how we use the platforms we're so blessed to have to do the most good.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch this evolution just over the last 2 years. And it's not only diverse employees who are expecting us to speak out on racial justice. It's all employees, which is what's interesting. I mean, I've seen numbers as far as 75% of employees expecting this. So it's a sea change.
Well, if I can just make a very quick comment, I know we're short on time, but many of the letters, in fact, half the letters I got from employees came from white employees. And it was interesting because it exposed something in the company, and that was the extent to which white employees had adopted Black kids. And they had their firsthand real experience with seeing the world through the lens of those Black children as a result of the George Floyd tragedy. So this affects all of us. This is not a Black problem or a white problem. It truly, and that event reminded me of that.
Yeah. Let's talk about other stakeholders, including investors. They're also focusing on developing meaningful metrics for assessing corporate responsibility and ESG. As a board member yourself, how do you think about driving real accountability around corporate citizenship? How do you think about moving from discussion to real action? And how do you track progress?
Let's pick up the thread of the conversation we had a moment ago about leadership. And I think certainly as directors, we're all leaders, both in our personal and professional lives, but also in the boardroom. And we have then the opportunity to hold CEOs and management teams to a really high standard. I learned a long time ago that one of the things you do is to inspect what you expect. So to the extent that we as a board or board members expect action here and discernible, substantive, exponential, not incremental results, we have to ask the management team to track those kinds of things. And it goes well beyond the representation within the company and the diversity of the employee population. It really does touch the ESG issues that you talked about a moment ago. What are we doing substantively to, in my business, for instance, improve the pipeline of STEM opportunities for undergraduates? And we sponsored an internship program for students from historically Black colleges and universities, and for Black students from colleges across the country. 10 very talented people joined the Cerevel ranks this past summer. So it's that example, and it's the inspection, it's the holding accountable, and it's not letting it go. This is not an annual succession planning or corporate organizational behavior dynamics presentation. This becomes part of the fabric of the boardroom conversation to ensure that we never take our eye off it. There are many, many other things, but let me stop there.
Well, I love already the Latin root of fiduciary. I'm taking that one. And now you cannot inspect, and we cannot expect what you can inspect is the second one I'm taking home with me. So this is great. As a board member, how do you balance issues of corporate citizenship against that fiduciary responsibilities you have to shareholders? How do you think about those trade-offs?
Well, we're being aided organically somewhat by, for instance, NASDAQ and its installation of rules regarding at least one woman director or one director of color. So I think there are those kinds of things that in the external system really reminding us, and that's a great example of inspecting what you expect. NASDAQ's been very clear about this, and I think that
Great leadership.
Yes, it is. It really is, and it was really quite striking. I wish they'd go one step further and not subdivide either female leadership for the leadership of diversity, but we do this in the steps that we need to do them, and I applaud their efforts there, and I think others will follow suit. And obviously, when we've inspected that, and we can look at the UK experience and the 30% target for boards to have female directors, to know that the measurement of those kinds of things really does make a difference and will translate into benefit.
What do you think are some of the specific next steps, the key next steps that the business community can and should take to advance anti-racism?
So I think about this in 5 categories, if you will, and this is in no means of order or priority, but I do think this continued focus on educating ourselves, and that's all of us. Black people don't have a monopoly on the knowledge here, so we are listening and learning with everyone else. But I will tell you that there's a clear point of view and a perspective that Black leaders can bring and should bring into the boardroom wherever they are. So the education, the increase in awareness would be one. The second is the fostering of discussion, and I think that goes along. We've circumnavigated or circumvented so many of these conversations because they're either socially awkward or they're just difficult conversations to have. The time has, I think, far passed for us to be awkward or uncomfortable on the issues that are really having a dramatic effect across society and inevitably in business, as we talked about. The third is the creation of accountability that we did talk about. I think it's very important for board chairs, board directors to be really very clear about the expectations they set, and obviously the installation of metrics that are appropriate go along with that. And that would be the fourth thing that I think we should think about. And then finally, and I know that this one will be controversial, but I'm a very big believer that compensation really has to be tied to the achievement and the progress that we hope to see in this particular area, whether it's 10 or 15 or 20 or 25% of a senior team's compensation, some portion of accountability where we expect behaviors to be incented, I think really is important. It's worked for business results, and I really can't separate progress in this area from numeric business results. Because if you go back to the simple thesis of George Merck, the doing well by doing good, there is no separation. And certainly, if we go back to fiduciary, there's no separation in the faithfulness or in the trust that we are provided as directors on behalf of others.
So one last question, and there are a lot of questions on the chat, which I'm going to hold until we add the panel. But what do you think is the appropriate role of boards in all this?
I think boards have to, let's take those 5 points. They've got to be as comfortable in the discussion. They have to not see it as a political topic. They have to see it as a matter of urgent business attention and need. And it's perhaps that last one where we can make the easiest and the quickest change. I don't believe that for the variety of issues that are facing us, social issues, social justice issues, climate justice issues, I don't believe that we've actually been very comfortable in holding or having those conversations in the boardroom for fear of tripping a wire, if you will. I think we've got to find a way to have the uncomfortable conversations as they impact business, not just for the simple sake of trying to convince anyone, but to really try to understand, if we look 15 or 20 years ahead, where the issues we're discussing today will bring the greatest benefit or the greatest risk to the businesses we lead tomorrow.
Well, thank you. A lot to chew on. I'm so pleased to bring two more individuals into our conversation. These two professionals are leaders in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Lee Pelton and Kiana Schmiedel.
Morning, Lee.
Hi,
Good
Lee.
morning.
Kiana.
Good morning.
Lee is the CEO and president of the Boston Foundation. He joined the foundation in June 2021 after serving as president of Emerson College and Willamette University. Lee's a well-respected thought and innovation leader. He's active in numerous civic, higher education, and philanthropic initiatives, including the Chamber of Commerce, where I've had the pleasure of working with him. In June, he was named by Mayor Walsh to lead the Boston Racial Equity Fund. He also serves as vice chair of the board of directors for the Chamber, as I mentioned, chair of the Boston Arts Academy Foundation Board, and on the boards of trustees for GBH, Facing History and Ourselves, Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, and the Barr Foundation. He was inducted by the Chamber into its Academy of Distinguished Bostonians. He has also received the Governor's Award for Mass Humanities and the Robert Cord Distinguished Leadership Medal in addition. Lee was honored by the EOS Foundation with a $100,000 racial justice grant in his name. And Kiana is the Global Head of Culture, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Wayfair. In this role, she has created the global strategy for weaving inclusivity into critical functions across the organization, enabling the organization to hire, inspire, assess, and develop a diverse and engaged workforce. Under Kiana's leadership, Wayfair has been named by Forbes as one of America's best employers for diversity and was listed by the Human Rights Campaign as one of the best companies for LGBT equality in 2021. Additionally, her stewardship of the culture has led to Wayfair's debut on Fortune's list of the world's most admired companies in the people management category. Since joining Wayfair in 2019, Kiana has launched several first-of-its-kind programming driving impact across organizational design, competency modeling, talent acquisition, safety and wellness, supplier diversity, and learning and development. Welcome, both of you. Delighted to have you with us. So let me start by reading you some statistics from a recent study, which I think kind of frames the discussion. So this new study conducted by KRC Research and United Minds among 1,500 employees in the US, Canada, and the UK shows a deep divide between corporate efforts to advance DE&I and the lived experiences of many employees. And I'll just cite some of the summary statistics. Nearly half of employees surveyed, 47%, report that they have personally experienced and or witnessed discrimination, harassment, and or microaggressions in their current organizations. 24% of employees who have experienced discrimination, harassment, and or microaggressions are considering leaving their organizations in the next year, 3 times as many as all employees in the benchmark. 34% of all employees, including 39% of leaders, believe DE&I initiatives are a waste of organizational time, effort, and money. And additionally, more than a quarter of employees have doubts whether their organization was working hard to build a diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture prior to the racial unrest of 2020. Let's start with you, Lee. Why is progress so slow when the business imperative is so clear?
Well, thank you. And I also want to thank you, Micho and Kathy, for hosting this event. And I know that both of you are deeply, great champions for this topic. And Tony, it's really a great pleasure to follow you. Well, the statistics that you cited are not new. They have been with us for a very, very long time. Though, as Tony pointed out, perhaps the breadth and depth of these issues in the wake of the triple pandemic of COVID-19, economic devastation, at least for some segments of our community, and a heightened awareness and scrutiny of the impact of these issues on segments of our society have made them more visible, and certainly made them, it's created kind of exposure, a public exposure. So we have all of these conversations happening today in a way that we probably would not have had 5 years ago. So we have to understand that what we're talking about here are systemic and structural issues. And systemic and structural issues require patience, some generosity, and a clear and compelling strategy to address them. And to say it a different way, what Tony said earlier, we need to make the case that diversity and excellence are joined at the hip, that excellence is impossible without diversity. And diversity, I mean, we know that diversity is evident in every aspect of our lives, from biodiversity to our investment portfolios. We see that as an aspect of excellence. So we need to make that case, that diversity and excellence are wedded, and that we can't have excellence. We can't have true excellence without diversity. We also, I think, in our companies and boardrooms and elsewhere, we need to move away from the notion that DEI is something that needs to be fixed. It's a problem that needs to be fixed. But it's really about achieving excellence. And excellence is not about being something, but it's always about becoming something. And so that excellence is about continuous improvement. And I think that needs to be, a critical aspect of our thinking about how we move forward on these issues in the boardroom and in our companies. And then finally, I tell my kids that outside of romantic love, the greatest human emotion, the emotion that's had the greatest impact on human history is fear. Absolutely. And so some of what you witness in these statistics is the fear of the zero-sum game. That is to say, if someone wins, someone else will lose. If that person over there wins, I'm going to lose. And that's a natural fear. But we need to find a way forward where all are winners. They're not losers and winners, but we're all winners. And so we have to make this strong case about the connection between the health of a company, the health of a board, and the excellence of a board and a company, so that we all benefit.
Comments from either Tony or Kiana on that?
Well, I'm happy to jump in here, and thanks to everyone for joining this morning. A few different thoughts are coming to mind. And I think around the idea of the reason why progress has been so slow is because we're still using old language to try to think differently about this challenge. And so when we in the past, when we were focused on diversity as compliance, we would say things like our diverse population, but we weren't being specific about who we were talking about. And that allowed a lot of people to opt out of being represented in that population. And so if you look at employee resource groups, what you see is that there are the women employee resource groups, those tend to be mostly white. Our Black employee resource groups have people of all genders, our Latinx employee resource groups, et cetera. And so when we're talking about our diverse population set, we need to start with the definition of diversity, which includes absolutely everyone. Because if you separate out white, if you separate out men, they then see themselves as not part of this conversation, definitely not benefiting from it. And it aids in that zero-sum mentality from the very population set that we need to partner with, that we need buy-in from, and that we need to be able to motivate to change some of these structures. I think too, even when you just think about the building space itself, I constantly go back to architecture building codes. These buildings were made for the workplace that was mostly men. When you think about the bathroom lines that women have to wait in, it's because we said, let's go with equality over equity. It takes women longer to use the bathroom, but we're going to give you just as many bathrooms as men. You know what actually solves for that? Having all gendered restrooms. And that then solves other challenges. But we're not thinking in the way of how can we solve multiple challenges by actually just going towards inclusion, as opposed to, well, how much is that going to cost me? In the long run, it's actually going to be much cheaper. And then I think, one of the last pieces is just businesses are now coming to grips with what it means to care personally at scale. They haven't had to do this before. They haven't been pushed by the employee population, by external factors. And so this isn't something that is taught in business schools. This isn't something that the current leadership structure has had to do well in the past in order to be deemed successful. And now all of a sudden we're saying you need to get it pretty quickly and you need to excel at it. And so the only way to do that is to bring in more voices that have different lived experiences to help you get it quicker. But that does take time to build those trusting relationships. And so these numbers are not surprising. They're what's existed all the time, but that's because so many things from our language to the structure of the workplace to how we relate to one another told us not to bring these types of conversations into the workplace until right now. And so there are only a subset of us who have had practice just constantly forcing our way into the discussion and saying it's okay to be awkward, it is okay for us to be uncomfortable, and it's okay to meet you where you're at, but we're not going to let you stay here. We have to move. And so let's figure out what pace is right for us.
So Kiana, staying with that, what have we learned in the last year that has been particularly effective in driving change?
Sure, I think it's just being honest and probably being a bit more specific and blunt than we've been comfortable with, right? It's this openness and transparency in the same way that we expect it around other areas of the business. We expect to understand what's happening for and to and with our people. I think it's also been that we've needed to understand who our population is to then know what we can do to support them in the ways that they need support, and that it's not a one size fits all, right? I was thinking about Lee and Tony, some of your comments around this triple pandemic. And I remember we went out in March and very quickly said, there's a whole slate of our workforce that is going to show up to work every day still, and not from their homes, right? We have people who work in warehouses. We have people who are delivering the furniture to everybody who's now working from home and says, I need a new home office space. How are we taking care of these folks? And how are we kind of deprioritizing the corporate population for a moment to say, what can we do for these folks? They are keeping our business afloat. We need them. We need them to know that they're appreciated, but we also need them to be safe. And so a lot of the safety measures that we're now piloting in our corporate office spaces, we have learned with our folks in our operations, in our supply chain, and our delivery networks. And that was a different way of operating for us. Typically things start in the corporate center and then they move outwards. And so I think we learned a lot also about the culture of the different spaces that Wayfarians occupy and what we can bring in that are some best and promising practices in those spaces that maybe before we weren't necessarily prioritizing as much or looking to as a way to set like a global standard. And so I think it's allowed us to really center different populations that we haven't looked to before for answers, for solutions, for partnership. And really that is the solve, right? Like that's the inclusion solve that we're all looking for.
Thank you. Tony, any thoughts on what has been particularly effective in the last year about driving change?
You know, I've just loved listening to both Kiana and to Lee, and I particularly loved Lee's thought about excellence is about becoming something, and I, as you did, Misha, I'm going to take that with me as a result of this. But I think this outside in thinking, Kiana, that you just talked about, is really very compelling. This is not particularly an example of diversity, but I will tell you, we obviously have a number of laboratory-based employees at Cerevel. They were home, as were many of, as were all of us during the height of the pandemic, but eventually they can't work from home because they don't have laboratories in their home. And we did actually have to take a policy where as they returned to work as essential workers, non-essential workers could not come back to the office in order to protect them. because they can only be in that workspace. So it's a little bit of turning the cube. And I think we're going to have to do this in many other cases where we're just turning the cube sufficiently and asking a different set of questions through a different lens. So I loved what you said about that. And of course, to the extent that we're in this conversation as executives and directors, we should be asking these questions in the boardroom. So we'll come back to that, I'm sure, Michelle, but I just wanted to highlight those two comments. I thought they were wonderful.
No, let's actually go to that and maybe start with Lee. And what role can boards play in helping companies create an environment that nurtures diversity internally, externally, grows leaders, and creates a broader community in support of diverse talent?
Well, you know, someone once said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so foremost—
I'm taking that one home too.
All right. So foremost, the board must have the courage to do an honest appraisal or assessment of the company and its own commitment to what we are calling DEI. And the board must assume this as a central function of its roles and responsibilities. In my experience, board that I sit on out on the West Coast, it's a public utility, and that Marcy knows well. I see that she's here at this program. The CEO and the HR director, who should be a named officer, by the way, in my view, in our corporate boards, play an important role. And for us, the HR director is present in most, if not all, of the board non-confidential meeting sessions, so that we can interact with her and she can interact with us around a set of important issues that go beyond just what I would call DEI, but the entire ecosystem, and how we can, as we just heard brilliantly earlier, how we can make a difference in the way in which we organize our work. At PGE, where I'm the chair of the Nominating and Corporate Governance Committee, we have an overall strategy that is regularly tested. It's regularly reviewed. We have an annual report from our HR director on the progress that we are making in these issues. And then I just want to emphasize something that we heard earlier about equality and equity. We have to understand the difference between the two. They're related, but not the same thing. And shorthand is that equality equals equal inputs. Equity equals equal outputs. And we really ought to be, in our companies, focused on equal outputs, not just equal inputs, if we're going to make any significant changes.
Well,
Misha,
go ahead, Tony.
Really, just one really quick comment. You know, I think it's really easy for us as, if you will, directors and senior executives to say and to do all of the right things that we intend to do. I think we really do understand it. But I know some of the conversation that I've been involved in, and even in this forum today, has been about middle management and the role that middle management can play in carrying forward and executing in these particular areas. And that's obviously a layer of the organization that most boards don't interact with. So I just thought I might address that for 1 minute. That is where I do think compensation as a key element or a key lever becomes very important. And it's not just the senior management compensation, but farther down in the organization so that it's across the entire team. I know several organizations, not many, but several, did go to using compensation as a lever for their senior teams. And in my conversations with some of those CEOs, their simple response was, well, we've got to start somewhere and it's just easier because I've got a senior structure of 10 to 100 people, depending on the size of the organization. I think we need to reinitiate the conversation about the role that compensation will play. And it's not to use it as a hammer as much as it is an incentive to create the desired outcomes. Other than that, it's hard to change hearts and minds. It's really hard to change folkways. And so we have to have a multi-pronged approach to reach that middle layer in the organization. that may not be antithetical to the goals we want. They simply may not consider them a priority in many instances, and that's certainly been my case. So I just wanted to touch on that point, because we wouldn't ordinarily in a board forum talk about that, but that's one of the fastest ways to get everything done. That's through the frontline leadership and management.
I couldn't agree more. Kiana, given the key role data plays in every aspect of business, what is the role of data in helping us root out racism, change culture, and think holistically about DE&I?
I love this question because I am obsessed with data, which is why I'm at Wayfair, because they too are obsessed with data. I think for a long time, people data was not the easiest data to access or work with. And one of the key reasons why I did join Wayfair is because they had a DEI analytics function. Their data sets were already broken out by dimensions of diversity that we had self-reported data for. But they also were encouraging folks to dig into the data, ask interesting questions, and present information. And as part of that exploration, we leveraged natural language process. As obsessed as I am with data in general, I am obsessed with telling a story through data. And that means balancing qualitative and quantitative data to understand what exactly is going on. And so using natural language process, we assessed our performance reviews, and we assessed them on the basis of gender. What are the opportunity areas that are talked about most often for women versus those for men? And what we came up with in this instance was actually, it came down to one word: confidence. And so with that, I got so excited because so many women on this call right now, I can see them nodding and saying, yes, I've heard that before. And I got excited because at the time we had a competency around communication and persuasion. So there I could say, here's this qualitative word of confidence. It should then map to lower scores in communication and persuasion, and it didn't. And so that told us this word is being used as a catch-all. We don't have a clear definition for what it means, yet we're telling women you either need more confidence or to display more confidence, and that is so subjective. So we took that and we put it into our calibration preparation sessions. We shared the word broadly with so many across our organization. And the purpose of that was to say, when you hear this word, please flag that. And please ask probing questions to get more objective. Ask them what specific behaviors are we looking for or did you not see? And what are the impacts to the business when you don't see those things? And once we did that, in one performance cycle, we saw the overall ratings for women increase for the first time over that of men. And so we know that it works when you focus on language and when you focus on language in that moment. We also know that in companies where there's a pay for performance culture, that then shifts the mark for people, because then all of a sudden you see increases in pay because people are getting better performance ratings. So to what Tony and Lee are mentioning, we are now looking at, can we set a people manager inclusivity score to say part of your evaluation is based on how inclusive you are in your people management and how you partner with folks, as well as all of the other competencies that we feel are critically important. And so we've taken that natural language process analysis. We've now done it for all of the dimensions of diversity, again, that we have self-reported data for. We built a bot where people can just submit their employee reviews and have the bot scan for biased language and point them to resources to understand why that language is biased, in what context is it biased, against whom or for whom, and how do you change it? And if you don't want to change it, that we're going to definitely be talking about it in the calibration session. And with that, we are then permeating throughout the organization. We need to change the way we talk about our people. We need to better understand how the subjectivity seeps its way into our performance process. And we need to be honest about how we're evaluating people and how much of that can be objective versus how much of that is subjective.
Fascinating, really, truly fascinating, and such breakthrough thinking and use of data, really impressive. So thank you for sharing that. Tony, Lee, do you want to add anything to that about the role of data?
I think it's clearly critical. We talked about metrics, and I made the general comment about compensation, but imagine, for instance, a world where you've got even half the sophistication that Kiana talked about a moment ago, where you could then use those to set the KPIs, to set the metrics that would then be linked to compensation. So I love the living example of that application of data. Not every organization will have that degree of sophistication, but data is going to be critical in figuring this. And it just, diversity is not just demography. And that's what I love about the approach that Wayfair is taking. Diversity really is broader about just the numbers, broader than just the numbers. And it has to do with not just the way we think, but in the outputs that we expect, which will all roll up to a better outcome, I'm convinced, to Lee's comment. But I think that the availability of data and metrics from an accountability point of view and a compensation measurement and assessment is something I'm a very big believer in.
What I would add to this conversation, and I think which is becoming apparent, that I think that some companies, and I can say this is probably true in higher education as well, is that we are over-reliant, and this is going to seem contradictory, but we're over-reliant on DEI training. And that's to say there's a view that if we can just change people's minds through training, then we're going to address these structural, systemic, long-standing issues. But I think it falls into the trap of this is something that needs to be fixed. And what you're hearing today so far is that we're talking about an entire ecosystem that is capable of change at so many different levels. We have many levers that we can pull. Companies, nonprofits, that can fortify and improve equity within the company. And so that, for me, that's the big takeaway from this discussion. Because as we all know, I mean, oftentimes DEI training is seen as indoctrination. You're treading on my political or even religious values and perspectives. And I think what we're hearing now is that we need to take a more holistic approach, as we've heard from Tony and Kiana, because this is a holistic issue.
It makes it too easy to just check the box.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Kiana, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think as somebody who, kind of cut their teeth in DEI as a consultant, delivering and facilitating so many training, something that I have always said about training is that training is great for building awareness and baseline, like this is the language that we're going to use. However, people pull that lever to solve for key behavioral change and structural challenges. Mm-hmm. And that's why DEI training gets such a bad rep. Mm-hmm. And so we need to also help folks to understand the purpose of the training in the first place, and that it is not going to be the quick solve. And yes, is it good for a check the box of, does everybody clearly understand these key definitions and these terms? Sure. But then it's, how is this worked into the process that I then interact with on a daily or quarterly or monthly basis so that I'm continuing to use those muscles and get better at this work? And so, just for me personally, when I landed at Wayfair, I told people in my first year, I am not delivering an unconscious bias training, nor am I going to set recruiting and hiring goals, because we need to understand what's going on in our culture that is not working for everyone, so that we can then create real solves and show some like genuine investment in the holistic work that needs to be done. Do we have a training now? Yes, we do, but that's based on the data that we have, the trends that we see, the performance cycle as we know it, the hiring cycle as we know it, and we tie it to those systems so that people then go back to those systems and access the resources that are related to those systems. So I think too, to be fair to the training itself, we need to make sure we're using it in the right way and for the right purpose.
Fascinating. Well, we certainly, let's shift for a second to an area that I spend a lot of my life in, reputational risk. And we know how incredibly important risk is to boards. We monitor it very carefully, take it very seriously. So there's a delta of reputational risk for companies between their stated commitments on racial equity, which the Washington Post recently put at a $50 billion promise that corporate America has made since last year, and their ability to show results. What can directors do to help companies that are struggling to show progress? What role should the risk committee play? Let me go to Tony, to you on that to lead, and then others can join.
You know, obviously we spend as directors a lot of time thinking about enterprise risk management in all of its various forms. And I will tell you that one of the things that I will be looking very carefully at for the boards that I'm involved in is the inclusion of this particular area, and that is the one of both ESG, but also of diversity management and inclusion. Not necessarily as an area of risk, because we shouldn't assume until we understand better that there's a risk element, but as an area of consideration in the assessment of risk. And I think that that's something that we shouldn't overlook. So that's at least on the formal side of things. But think for a moment about everything that the Me Too movement, that the Time Up movement, which is having its own moment now, has brought to us in terms of our awareness of the very real both litigation and risk liability that we have in these particular areas. So it's always, I think, an ounce of prevention that is worth a pound of cure. And the reason I'm loving our conversation here is these are all really practical ways in which we can exert or exercise an ounce of prevention to offset the risk that you talked about. But it does remind me that analyzing some of these particular topics is going to be an important part of the boardroom conversation for enterprise risk management. And if it's excluded as a risk area, then demonstrate and show why it is, and what you're doing to proactively address not just the demography, but the conversation and the real potential risk of liability and other enterprise risk elements.
Lee or Kiana, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Tony said it all, in that I think that we're to consider the reputational risk of not living up, and I guess that's the question you're asking too, of not living up to our commitments on racial equity. I think, and this is just from my own experience, which may be incomplete, that I think companies are still struggling with ESG. We don't all have a clarity around it, how it should appear in our proxies and so on, and what approach we should take. Does it belong to the audit committee, or is it something that belongs to the nominating and governance committee? So that's a work in progress.
Kiana, anything to add to that?
All I would add to that is, I think what companies are finding now, especially as over the last year, we've all seen the articles about the big organizations where people are either leaking the data or, telling these horror stories about their experiences, is that you have more reputational risk in keeping your head in the sand, not looking to either prove or disprove that you have similar challenges going on, and then not being transparent with your employees about it, right? One of the key pieces in the data piece that I shared with you all is that the only way we got to a bot for Wayfair was by telling our employees, this is what we're finding is going on, and we want to create meaningful change. However, that means that you all need to be the accountability buddies in this process. And so that there's not something there to, I don't know, leak, because we're saying, we're seeing this challenge, it's happening here, here's how we're trying to fix it. And then we report out on, here's the progress we made toward that goal. We're trying to decrease these gaps. We're trying to increase, XYZ, KPIs and all of these other things. And we tell our employees how we're doing and where we're making changes to get better at it. And so I think a lot of companies now are just kind of rethinking what actually is the risk. And it's actually the risk of not doing something, not looking for it, and not talking about it.
Mishra, can I add one thing?
Yes.
Because I'm really struck by this distinction between kind of enterprise risk management and reputational risk, for instance, which of course exists on the spectrum. But I'm also struck as we talk about risk in that it's inherently fear-based in a way.
Mm-hmm.
We're afraid of the consequence. We want to avoid the risk. We want to manage the risk, all to get a negative situation back to neutral or to prevent it in the very first place. And what I'm struck by in that distinction is this whole notion that there's probably an opportunity that isn't fear-based here, and that is of competitive differentiation. In our recruitment right now for our non-lab-based employees, we are recruiting across the country, and as I'm sure many of the participants here, making allowances for individuals, given this great gift of technology, to live wherever they want, as long as they can perform the work. I can tell you that 18 months ago, that was not our perspective. Members of my executive team needed to relocate to Boston or spend a significant amount of time in Boston. And now we're taking a very different point. The point here is that there's a competitive differentiation opportunity for us if we just think about some of the things that we've been discussing and how we can distinguish ourselves as employers. I actually believe it will be a point of competitive differentiation for us and for all businesses who accept flexible work arrangements and even hybrid work arrangements long after the pandemic has been addressed and resolved. Because there's a new mood in the country amongst the workforce for a variety of hybrid arrangements, and we've got to respond to that. Well, why can't we take this set of issues we've been discussing and find the competitive differentiation moment and be inspired by the opportunity rather than fearing the risk of something terrible happen? I'd just inject that perspective.
Yeah. The interesting thing I have watched evolve is that the number one risk now is really rooted in culture. If you've got a culture, if you don't have the right culture, that's where all the risk is. It used to be that the number one, cause of crisis was really a negative event. Now it's much deeper. Now it's really a cultural rift that is causing you to be called out because your behaviors are not matching your values. So it's a fascinating, and it's an opportunity, you're right, for companies to be proactive. But I think we have a very active chat. So I'm going to ask Ellen to serve up a question from the audience and start engaging our audience that is eager to be engaged. Ellen, do you want to, there's no way I can go through that long chat and pick one. So please pick one.
So tied to what we're talking about now is that there's a great question which says, how do we address the backlash against teaching systemic racism and anti-racism learning in corporate America? And this, I think, also ties to a later question, which asks about sort of middle management. But how do you really get everybody engaged with this backlash that's occurring, at least in many companies, about why are we so focused on this and not either business or other issues?
Kiana, you want to take that one first?
Happy to do that. I think, for us in the last year, after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, I found myself realizing, because I was at home, I could take the moments that I needed to when I just could not quite pull myself together. And I was realizing a lot of people were doing that. And so instead of defaulting to kind of a training, or, yes, we did send out internal memos, what we did was decide to hold a public forum conversation. And we called that Change Starts at Home. And we invited members of Way Black, which is our Black ERG, who had wanted to share their stories. And we didn't limit them to their story sharing. We said, talk about whatever it is that you want. 4 people shared experiences, their lived experiences in other workplaces, just going about their day-to-day life, questioning microaggressions in performance and with their managers and connecting with their teams. And then after that, we pivoted to a conversation with leaders, including our CEO. And one of the first questions I asked him in there was, he had a history of talking about Wayfair as a meritocracy. And so I said, given everything that we've heard, what we know now, do you still believe that Wayfair is a meritocracy? And in front of 4,000 people that were live streaming at that time, he said, unfortunately, no, but I want us to be. And so here's what I want to commit to in order to get us there. And that's what sparked a lot of this work. Those same conversations are part and parcel of so many DEI trainings where you're trying to get people to connect to a story, to change their hearts and minds, to then change their behaviors. But instead putting it in a forum where nobody is allowed to question the experiences of people, but they are supposed to and did question our leadership on what are we doing about this and how are we going to be different than other organizations. You saw real change happen. And so I think that a lot of organizations have been exploring what are some other non-traditional training ways for us to get the information out there, have people participate in the conversation and feel like they should be owning and driving some of the work and some of the discussion. So I think it's just taking the idea of training and saying, how do we think different? How do we go more holistic with this? How do we have these conversations at scale that get more people involved and create more of that pull versus a push?
Misha, can I offer something on that?
Yes, please.
I'm struck by that anecdote, Kiana, for a couple of reasons. One, I think your CEO's statement is probably more powerful or as powerful as any racism course we could ever imagine, because it's a simple reflection of the internal culture, his own admission that it hasn't lived up to his expectations and what he would do to commit to address it. And that's at the end of the day what we want. I think this whole conversation around anti-racism training as either the right thing or the wrong thing is really a red herring. I think that we have allowed ourselves to be distracted by that as the only solution and defaulting to that as the key through which we would manage this particular issue. So much so that we've developed emotion around whether it should or shouldn't be and really lost sight of the overall outcome. So I again, as directors, since we're in a director's forum, I think this notion of really asking ourselves the question, what is the outcome we want? In your case, it was a more meritocratic Wayfair. And how do we get that? Because anti-racism training as a thing may not be the solution to achieve that objective. And I just think we have to hold open the prospect that the emotion and the charge we have around the partisan or the polarized things that we think are the solutions should be relaxed in lieu of the greater objective. I'm really struck by that story.
Thank you for that. Ellen?
Yeah, we talked earlier, Tony mentioned the need to have compensation, an element of compensation tied to this achievement of this issue. But there's a direct question in the chat which says, what, and I'll say specific KPIs do you see the board using to quantify the objectives, measure success in order to drive accountability? So this is a real takeaway, right? I mean, if we want to tie it to compensation or we just want it to tie it to accountability, are there specific KPIs that the board should be thinking about?
Lee, you want to take that?
Well, yes, I mean, I've not been a CEO of a corporate place. I've been in nonprofits all my life, but I did previously, we tied compensation to, not all of it, obviously, but part of it, to the commitment to diversity. And the way it appeared for us is both looking at the talent of individual, vice presidents, and whether or not the folks who work there were representative of the diversity of this country and so on. We also made sure that, I mean, some of the KPIs were related to the, and again, I'm a heavily programmed organization, but KPIs tied to the kinds of programming that each of our vice presidents were engaged in, and each vice president had to set their own goals for meeting the diversity mandate that we had set, and so it was different for one vice president from another. So there was no single KPI across all of those divisions.
Kiana, thoughts?
I think maybe this is my time to say the non-intuitive thing. But a question that I have been trying to work through around this idea of tying compensation is how to do that while also not creating perverse incentives to almost get it wrong on purpose or not really care, just to check a box, right? And say like, well, we made XYZ number of hires. It doesn't matter that they didn't work out, or, they only stayed for X amount of time and we'll just hire some more. Because you want folks to do this. I guess maybe you care less about whether they do it for the right reasons, but you want them to get it right. And do it with the right purpose. And so I actually, have a question around how is this working for people, especially in places that maybe are not quite there in terms of their senior leadership caring sincerely enough to say, and here's how we're going to put the expectations behind what that success looks like and have the long tail to that strategy.
Interesting. Tony, any thoughts on that?
Hey,
Sorry,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, Lee, but finish your thought and I'll go after you.
Lee, go ahead.
Well, I guess I don't want us to forget the central role that the board plays in all of this. And I think, as some of you have heard me say, that there's a view that the most effective antidote to inequitable, societal policies and procedures is to change the balance of power rather than seek to change the minds of those in power. And I don't mean this as a disjunctive, that's either or, but it's part of an ecosystem. And so the board has a really central role in this. I remember, some years back, the S&P 500 had set a goal for, I think it was 20% of women on corporate boards. I think it exceeded that goal. I think it was 15 at one point, then moved to 20%. But it also turns out that it's a statistical fact that corporate boards or that corporations with a female CEO will have a greater fraction of board members who are female than male. And that does not happen by accident, because I think that gets back to what we've been talking about before, the sort of the lived experience of folks. And, I can tell you that I chair the nominating, and I just said this, nominating corporate governance committee at a public utility, which is historically predominantly white male engineers. And on our board, we now have, out of 11, we have 4 people of color and 3 women, soon to be 4. And again, this did not happen by accident.
So just a quick thought. We talked about the fact that diversity is not simply demography, but demography is a part of it. And so while the KPIs will vary by business, the key performance indicators will be based on what business outcome you are seeking or the sector that you're competing in. So it's really hard to be prescriptive there, but a core part of any metric, any KPI, I think does have to be, what does the organization itself look like to ensure that we have this diversity of thought? And that would extend to the board as well. It's quite interesting. Boards historically have been willing to hold senior management to demography objectives and not necessarily themselves. And that's been quite a fascinating experiment to watch go away in the last 2 or 3 years. At Cerevel, for instance, we've got 11 directors, 3 of whom are Black, which is quite striking by any measure, and 3 of whom are women. And this is a highly specialized technical company, but I can tell you that the conversations we have around the board table today with that representation are very different than the conversations we had before we had this degree of diversity. So one of the KPIs has to be demography, and then it's hard to be prescriptive beyond that.
Yeah, before we go back to another question from Ellen, I want to make sure that we cover what role the panel thinks investors should have and are having on driving this kind of change. I'll start with you, Tony, on that. But what role are investors playing, and what's the proper role? What's the proper push?
It's an interesting question because investors are such a broad category. I think you've got the technical investors who will only make investment decisions on technical parameters and will trade on the basis of an algorithm. I think it's really hard to be in a conversation about anything other than the technical indices that group of investors follows. However, if we take them in the more traditional sense of the word, and we think about institutional investors, they're clearly beginning to make their voices known, not only through what we talked about in the NASDAQ approach, but through their own internal corporate governance guidelines, which are now beginning to evolve for many of the institutional firms who are looking at this issue. I think it's still in flux, but as we see that evolve, as we saw it evolve in the separation of the chair and the CEO role, as we're watching it evolve in terms of questions around overboarding and the variety of things that individual and institutional shareholders want to see, I suspect that over the next 5 years, we'll see this particular topic dimensionalize itself. We will bring more as we bring more rigor to the data, and I'll go back to the Wayfair experience. We will see this topic dimensionalized, and I wouldn't be surprised if the BlackRocks of the world, the Wellingtons, the Fidelities, the State Streets, many of the Vanguards, wouldn't begin to look at their own individual set of ESG and other governance criteria and begin making judgments in this area. I think that's only a matter of time because they live in the same world we do. They understand that these are real issues that have an impact on the bottom line, not just to enhance it, but to manage some of the liability we talked about a moment ago. So this is an area that I'll be watching very, very carefully.
Kiana, do you feel the pressure from investors? Are they interested in the data?
I think that investors are not only interested in the data, they're interested to know what you're doing with the data, right? Because a lot of companies have been presenting information. It's just kind of buried in the latest report out and then the end. And so I think it's actually great to see investors get involved in that way and to care deeply, because then it kind of heightens the awareness of, oh, okay, as a leader, either within the organization or on the board, I should know more intimately what's going on here and how we're moving the needle. I think without that, it's easy for a number of folks to forget about it and just say, as long as it's reported in there, that's fine, and we don't necessarily need to get into it.
Lee, anything to add to that?
No, I just from my experience, our large institutional investors are really pushing at us on ESG, and to be much clearer about what it means for us and how we, how we measure progress and so forth. And we look at this. We look at this constantly. Probably at this point would give us B-, C+ in that area in terms of our at least the way we represent our, our ESG in our company. So we've got a lot of work to do, and I would just say that some of that work, is being, we're compelled to do it because of our institutional investors.
Yeah. Ellen, back to you for another audience question.
Sure. One of the questions referred to the fact that many corporations made commitments to advance racial equity. We have not always seen these commitments realized. How can we help ensure pledges are kept? Now, we were just talking about shareholders and investors. That's certainly one way from an oversight standpoint, but there may be other ways in addition to that. So how do we make sure I hate to say the laggards, but the folks who made commitments and are not keeping them, how do we keep the focus on them?
Tony, you want to take that?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and I'm of two minds on the question. So first, of course, we applaud the intention and the intent, but so many of things like this just fall by the wayside if they're not monitored or measured or held accountable. So there's that problem. I'm equally interested in the companies and corporations that haven't made any commitment at all, for instance. So once again, we've got the entire universe of companies where some have decided that this is important. They've made a set of commitments, and we want to assess whether they're living by them, which I think is right. That's the accountability point we've been discussing. But there's that much bigger universe of companies that have been largely silent on this particular topic and are still taking the time to either figure out what they want to say or what they want to do before they've even made even a verbal commitment to upholding the principles. So once again, I don't think we should isolate those who have committed, but look at this in totality. Now, if you go back to the Washington Post article and the really careful assessment of the data of corporations where commitments were made, I think it really is important that companies say what it is that they've actually done. We may not necessarily know, but I'll just point to Bank of America because they've been, I think, one of the great examples of having made a significant commitment. That is their $1 billion commitment in this area. They were very careful earlier this year to provide a regular report card and a regular update as to against that particular commitment, what they had done and in what amounts. And I, for one, follow that with great interest because that's a sign not just of leadership, but of saying exactly what it is that you're doing. So I think we should be encouraging companies to be vocal and quite verbal when they do indeed live up to these commitments. But let's not forget those who haven't made any commitment at all. They're the hearts and souls we still have to reach.
But also to be able to talk about why they're not meeting their commitments and be honest about
Sure.
it. It's such a learning opportunity.
Right. And look, you set lofty goals, and I've done that as part of an annual corporate goal setting process and made commitments to my board, and they were too aggressive. So I've had to go to the board and say, that was an aggressive set of goals. We fell short, still the right goal, and we'll fix this. So I think engaging in that dialogue is, again, going to make it okay for all points of view to emerge, and we should be promoting more points of view than not, I think, in this discussion.
I would say in summary, I mean, what you're saying so wonderfully is that these commitments must be measured. They have to be measurable. And the board and the company have a responsibility to to review where they are on a variety of goals around this issue. You know, at least annually, but certainly I would think more than that. But it has to be measurable. They have to be measured. You have to have measurements. Without that, you're not. There's no way to know what sort of success, or there's no way to know what sort of progress you're making on these issues.
Kiana?
At Wayfair, one of our people principles is respect others. And the description for that, the first two sentences are, we presume best intent, but we prioritize impact. And so it's to move away from, you can have the best intentions of the world, but if your impact did not land with that person or with that group or in the way that it was supposed to, then that's what you need to focus on, because that's where the opportunity lies. I also believe that with greater transparency comes the opportunity to demonstrate more humility. And a lot more organizations need to be comfortable with, we need to be humble. We don't have all the answers. We're not always going to get this right. It's important that we do set stretch goals, but it's important to kind of land in that space of, we want these goals to feel like a stretch, but be reasonably achievable, because we don't want to set them so far out that everybody knows we're not going to get there. And so they just kind of peter out halfway through. And so I'm interested to see what comes of this next year and the next year around some of these commitments for these organizations that just came out of the gate really hot. Because I think that they're going to find that it's not as easy as, we're committing all of these dollars and we've done that now. And so now we're on to the next thing. It's a long-term process, and they're going to need to keep refining and understanding what it means to be in this space as a true partner, which also means receiving the feedback of where they're not getting it right. And are they open to that and pivoting from there?
I see a great question from Kathy on the chat, which I'm gonna go to next, which is, this conversation has been focused on DEI, but isn't it really about appropriate management in general? Can companies survive in an increasingly diverse market without the level of change we're talking about? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can. Well, Kiana, please.
I'll just jump in really quick and say, part of the reason why I lead culture and inclusion at Wayfair is for that very reason. When I landed, I was there to lead DEI, and we had a culture and values team. And in my assessment, I told them, I don't think that these two things should be separated, because essentially what we're saying is we have a culture for the organization and DEI floats outside of that. What we are talking about here is the new skills for managing, for leading, and for driving these organizations has to include an inclusion lens. And the fact that we've let folks go this long and have said that they've been successful without that being an integral part of their leadership capability set has set up some of these challenges that we're facing now of saying, no, it has to be there now. But to the point that Kathy has made, the market is shifting and moving us in that direction. The employee population, when we think about generations in the workplace, we're now at a place where very quickly the assessment is, if this organization does not live by its values, if the organization's values do not match up with what I believe, then I'm out of here. And so unless companies want to keep having this great churn, they're going to need to get this right and have more of a focus on inclusion across all aspects of the business, and not just in the space that DEI typically exists.
You know, there's data to this this effect as well, and we've been talking largely about the impact of these particular issues on employees, both as directors and senior executives, and in that conversation within the company. But there is a well-described Edelman research study from earlier this year that speaks to the fact that consumers, because we've just been talking about employees, consumers actually, in 60 to 70% of the time, as self-reported, would make decisions about which brands they choose based on their alignment with the company's social values. And of course, we see this in its simplest form in the boycotts that are executed oftentimes around a particular company and their stance on anything. But if you imagine the collective economic power of the consumer role here, this becomes an issue that's sine qua non for how we not only run businesses, but look for business outcomes. So it isn't just in the recruitment and the retention of employees and keeping them happy and doing the right thing, all of which are essential. At some point, there becomes a very important consumer-facing dimension to this that will impact the bottom line. And if we extend that notion to not just Americans, I want to relate an anecdote. This was at the Robin Hood Investor Conference in New York City, 2017, shortly after the 2016 election. And there was an open question from one of the speakers where there was a consideration that as we think about where America stands on the world stage, forget American hegemony for a second, but as we think about that, how closely aligned is the American brand with the American approach to global leadership, to democracy, and to everything that's gone to define this country? And what's the link in the relationship? Because what I know, this CEO of a Fortune 10 company said, is that people will make a choice to buy American because of the brand behind democracy, global leadership, and everything else that the country stands for, and they'll pay more. So it's a really interesting question about whether we can actually afford not to do anything against this. And I think Kathy's right to point us in the direction of whether this just has to be something that becomes essential as we think about not just internal populations, but domestic and global business opportunities for us as well.
Thank you for that. Ellen, back to you.
Sure. There's some interesting shift to the questions. Georgia asked early on while Tony was speaking, and Linda Whitlock came back to the topic, which is really about employees' activities outside the company, engaged in their communities. And the question I'll read from Linda's is whether and how companies should be engaged with their local communities, particularly in helping to enhance racial and economic justice.
Lee, you want to take that?
Well, my view is it's fairly simple that the companies ought to be engaged as a civic leader in their communities around a variety of issues, and certainly this issue that we're talking about today is important. I think some companies have, maybe all companies have, matching programs where employees, can give up to a certain level and they'll be matched by the company as a way to incentivize employees to be civically engaged through charitable contributions and so on. But I think this is essential and vital, and it also gets back to, I think, what we talked about earlier is the some of the reputational issues, so this is not something to run from, but really to run towards. That is to say, run towards our role, company role as a civic leader in our community or broader, even nationally. And we, there's so many examples of this that I need not cite them.
Yeah. But again, it's the expectations of a new generation of the role of companies, which has radically changed. I was struck by a survey. We do a survey on just a pulse poll and all these things, every month, just to track the changing environment in this period. And I'm struck that employers have a higher degree of confidence by both employees and consumers that they can lead us out of the pandemic, that they can unify around issues that are divisive, and that people feel that there's more civility at the workplace than in their communities. All this has held steady for employers at the same time that it's gone down for government. Even the CDC, we have watched just, lower in terms of confidence in it. So it's a big responsibility in a way, and something to run towards, right?
It is. And in the company that I'm at, we make a big deal. Annually, we will report out to the employees and even beyond And again, this is not anything new, but we'll report out, what's the total annual contributions from employees with and without the match from the company. And it's a really big deal, and employees here take a lot of pride in it. It engages them in a way that's meaningful, not only for themselves, but for the company and for the communities that we serve.
Kiana, your thoughts on that?
Sure. I'll give this example. Last year in June, we had opened up an employee match because we saw a lot of folks on their own trying to organize some donations to racial justice organizations. And so we opened up an employee match and we said it will be for the month of June. And by the end of that month, we closed out with $900,000 in donation. And so we know that our employees want to do more. And so in that, we had a new leader come in for corporate responsibility, and he and I have been hip and hip saying, what do we do here? How do we engage the population to let us know where we should be directing funds, have them help us to vet the list of organizations and what some of their considerations are, so that we can then take back some of that knowledge and then create the set of criteria. And that's what we did. And we launched an internal impact council. And we said, we want representation from across the company to help us to get better and fine tune towards what the organization wants. I think the other thing is at Wayfair, we're everything home. And so for me, it just made sense to say, from homelessness to home ownership, what are we doing in this space? And that in the communities in which we work, we should also serve. And so, in building that out, our employees were already doing that. We just went to them and said, how can we help, or, organize, get you more resources, get you more materials, and talk to the organizations about what is it that you need. Is it that you need donations in terms of furniture and things like that? Or is it that you need monetary donations? I think a lot of organizations just write a check and say that's it, when they could be a bit more creative. And it could feel that much better, especially to the employee population, to know the different ways in which they put skin in the game.
Tony?
Nothing to add. The only consideration that applies to us at Cerevel is this is an extension of our values, and that we actually did construct the company. It's a small startup biotechnology company that is growing, but we did construct the company with an articulation of our values and the culture we wanted to build. We built this in, and so it's just a natural extension of both, I think, who we are as a leadership team, but also the kind of people we want to attract to the company as well. So I love that if this is part of the core set of values or things that you hold sacred as a company, because ultimately, if you don't have something anchoring you, you will become, or you'll get the culture you deserve. A good friend of mine once said to me, and I love that. So I love the living expression, and by extension, it just means that we've got to be supportive of employees because we want them to be engaged in the world. We're in the business of enhancing people's lives. That's what the biopharma industry does. And if we restrict that to simply health and healthcare, we're missing a really big opportunity to not only live our values, but have our employees be fulfilled. So I love the question. I love the conversation about it.
Thank you. Alan?
Yeah, coming back to the corporate match question, I think the interesting question is, if the company is doing a corporate match, does the company have some responsibility for vetting the organizations the match is going to, and how would that actually work?
Well, the company that I'm at, we have a funding arm, a foundation, and of course we would do exactly what you're asking here with respect, and we have a director of that, and so all of that vetting takes place at the foundation level. But I think it would be tricky to do the same for employees. But I get what's at the heart of the question, because some employees might be making contributions to groups or organizations that run counter to company values. And if that becomes apparent, then I'm not sure how to handle, how to handle that. I think that's where that question's probably coming from.
Another element in leading in a divided society, which is of course reflected in our workforce.
Yeah, exactly.
But Kiana or Tony, anything to add to that?
No, I think it's been well said.
All I would add is, again, calling back to that impact council, this is one of the questions that we posed, right? How do you all think? Because we wanted our employees to understand the nuances of these challenges. I think sometimes it's really easy when you get an impassioned group of folks who say, no, we shouldn't do this, or yes, we should do this, to understand where the gray area is. So we brought them into that discussion and said, what would you use as baseline vetting, just to see how our employees were thinking. And I think where we landed was, what's the hate group list that we're going to use to say, okay, none of the groups on this list will we allow donations to, and kept it pretty minimal, outside of, being like 503 organizations, et cetera.
Well, let's bring it home with one last question that hopefully will empower everybody listening to go back with some practical advice. What are the most important 2 or 3 things each of you recommends directors can do to encourage, support, and help companies lead on this issue? It's so crucial to attracting and retaining human capital. We'll start with you, Lee.
Well, first of all, this issue has to be top of mind for the board. As you've heard earlier, a recognition that this is not about fixing a problem, but this is about enhancing the reputation, the productivity of and the excellence of a company. And so we need to keep our our focus there. I do think, and what I'm going to say might be a little controversial here, but in the corporate world, as in the nonprofit world, colleges and universities, we often privilege credentials over talent, and then we lose out on great talent. And by that, I mean, we often privilege credentials over, experience that lies outside of the formal educational structure. And I'm not sure, how you, I'm not sure how you counteract this in a corporate structure, but it is something that we've began to think about, especially, as I said, as a company where it's made up of, by and large, engineers who traditionally have been white male, and we're seeking to diversify our workforce by looking outside of our usual talent pools. And I think in order for us to be successful, we're going to have to, look at experiences that are worthy of and suitable to the job. So I would just say it's got to be top of mind, and it's going to require patience, generosity, and time.
Thank you. Tony, thoughts?
Yeah, this has been such a rich conversation because we've had a discussion around KPIs and metrics and compensation and all of the things that I think are levers for us as either executives or directors. But one thing we haven't really talked about is something that I think is one of the most successful factors, or one of the most important factors for success in business, and that's courage. And I guess what I'd offer, maybe by way of a parting comment, is I think we can't be afraid to take a stand. I think that we sometimes are bound in data or bound in perception, and it paralyzes us in terms of making a stand. I'm reflecting kindly on our good friend Ken Frazier, the outgoing CEO at Merck, and the very bold move and really courageous move he took on the beginning end of this conversation around corporate leadership and stewardship. And it might have been unheard of prior to that for any business leader to take such a public stand on a non-directly business issue. But in retrospect, that was clearly the right thing. And he set a standard for all of us to follow. And I think we can't be afraid to not only take a stand, but just find those moments where the distinction that courage brings can actually be useful. Earlier this year, we haven't talked much about my work with the Black Economic Alliance, but we worked with a group of 60 Black business leaders to make a full-page ad when this question around the controversy around voter suppression came up in Georgia. And I can tell you as a result of behind-the-scenes conversations that changed hearts and minds of corporate chieftains across the country who then publicly came out against and spoke. And that led to a second advert that had 700 signatories in this particular area. I know my good friend Carol Fulp asked this particular question about voter suppression and what do business leaders think. I think business leaders are thinking that there are just some things where courage is simply required to take a stand. So my own personal exhortation, this is a reminder to me, and if useful to everyone else, please accept this humbly. Don't be afraid to be courageous. We can't fight every battle, but there are indeed some battles that are worth fighting, and leadership does not end or go away when I walk out of the office door at night, the virtual office door at night. But it's been a pleasure to be in dialogue with everyone.
Tony, and it's interesting you cite Ken Frazier, because I remember being so struck by two things, and I'm a huge Ken Frazier fan. First, that when he took the stand, he said, professionally and personally, I believe this is the right thing. And I thought, I've never seen a CEO so open up the connection between, you know, professionally and then I don't know if you remember, but there was not a lot of followership for hours. There was just dead silence. And I thought, this is really courageous, because it's not like everybody went in. So I'm so delighted that you used that example, because it reminds me what a profile in courage he was at that moment. Kiana, bringing it back to you.
Sure, I would say just a few things. The first is to over-index in transparency and humility. I think it's just sharing out the data that you have, what's going on in your culture, and where you have opportunity areas, where you've missed the mark, be honest about that. I think the second thing is, as leaders, to make sure that the DEI agenda is embedded in career, culture, community, and customer, right? It has to be in all of those places, as we talked about earlier. And then the last thing I would say is really aligned with this courageous conversation that we were just talking about, and that is to move away from careful conversations to thoughtful conversations. Careful conversations prioritize what I'm afraid of and how can I avoid even stepping my toe into that water, where a thoughtful conversation says, I know that there are pieces here that I'm not comfortable with, but it's important for me to go there anyway.
Thank you. Well, before I hand it back to Kathy, let me just say that what a privilege to moderate this incredible panel. You have both inspired us and given us incredible practical advice, which is a great combination. I always think of Labor Day as a threshold of starting over afterwards, whether you're going back to school or back, and especially this year when we're beginning to contemplate, many of us going back to the office. Thank you. What a wonderful way to have us all renew our commitment to do better. So thank you, and back to Kathy.
Thanks so much, everybody. I can only second, third, fourth, fifth, what Micho just said. This has been a phenomenal panel. We're just full of quotable quotes. But I want to mention three that I think kind of go together because they really stuck out in my mind. First of all, Tony, on the idea that diversity is not just about demography, but demography is a really important part of it. That's something at times when you get into discussions about diversity with people, they want to string it out to, how many of this, that, or the other do we have, as opposed to the real issues about diversity. And that's, how are we managing? How are we making the most of who we have in our company, our organization, our nonprofit? So that knowing the demography is not the be all and end all, but it is a good place to start, which takes me to Lee's quote about, it's not about being, it's about becoming, where we are all traveling to. No matter how great we might look, we always need to be working on this as part of our culture. And then finally, Kiana, I am never going to forget the term, and I hope I can get this right, accountability buddies. It's a great term, and I'm going to mention it on a couple of different organizations on which the board I sit on, because I think it's both about, it incorporates the ideas of measurement and culture. We are buddies in this culture. We may not all be doing everything we should do, but if we don't treat it as a buddy kind of a thing, we'll never get it done. We won't allow people to come into it as opposed to being afraid of it. So I can't thank the three of you enough. This is the most remarkable program I think I've sat in on. It's a third of ours involved with systemic racism. We were talking before the panel began about the potential of pulling the three programs together and have something that we can offer to our members and to others that really touches all of the points that we've been working on in terms of systemic racism as an issue, and more broadly, management and accountability as an issue in terms of using our resources in the best possible way. Let me just make a couple of quick announcements, and then you'll be all on your way by the time we promised. Our fall calendar at NACD is set. We have an excellent lineup, and we hope you're going to follow what our programming is on our website. I'm going to highlight a few things. We've been, as everybody else has, tossing back and forth, in person, not in person, virtual. And we really have, for a long time felt that an in-person program is the best kind of program for a group like NACD, which would both foster interaction among our members and foster interaction between our members and our panel at a personal level. However, given the current COVID-19 threat, our leadership has decided to either stay virtual or use a hybrid model, depending on the program. Now, we've sort of defined hybrid as a limited number of in-person tickets that are available on a first-come, first-served basis, with all other registrants participating virtually, but allowing everybody the same access to our speakers. So I'm honored to be moderating our first out-of-the-box program of this kind of hybrid nature. It's our annual kickoff event called the Visionaries Speak. We invite prominent New England CEOs to discuss what they see as the challenges and the opportunities in the coming year. This year's visionaries are Niran Chaudhry, the CEO of Panera Bread, Bob Rivers, the chair and CEO of Eastern Bank, and Prahlad Singh, the CEO of PerkinElmer. So we're hitting consumers, we're hitting tech, and we're hitting banking, thinking that those are the three areas that are going to be powerful in shaping the coming year. Whether you'd like to join in person or virtual, we encourage you to register as soon as possible today and choose the option that best suits you. In addition, our programming committee, led by Ellen Richstone, is working hard to design a year of exceptional programs. We have one on customer engagement on October 14th, which is a joint program with women corporate directors. And on October 26th, we are just excited to tell you that we are going to learn about the world of digital currency, including central bank digital currency, the so-called CBDCs. with Jim Cunha from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, who is spearheading that bank's effort on blockchain and digital currency, working with MIT. These programs will be virtual. We're holding out hope that the outlook on COVID starts to improve, and that we will be able to hold our in-person programs beginning in November, our Director of the Year program on December 9th, and in January, our annual proxy season review. That will be virtual. So look out in your emails every Tuesday for our list of upcoming events, and follow whether they're going to be virtual programs or in-person programs. I'm praying for in-person because that means the whole world has gotten better and we're comfortable getting together in each other's actual in-person camaraderie. I can't wait for that. Anyway, we value your comments today. Be sure to fill out the survey that you'll get later today, and give us the pluses and the minuses we want to improve, as all of us want to in everything we do. So thanks again. Thank you for joining us. And I can't thank our panelists enough for what was an extraordinary program. Micho, Tony, Lee, Kiana, thanks so much.
Thank you.